Giant leap for mankind. Do you know whose footprint this is? Do you know where it can be found? Give up? This is Neil Armstrong's footprint, and it is on the moon. On July 20th, 1969, astronaut Neil Armstrong became the first man ever to step foot on the moon. He was the commander of the Apollo 11 space mission of 1969. Armstrong flew to the moon with astronauts Edwin Buzz Aldrin and Michael Collins. Collins circled the moon in command of the module Columbia, while Armstrong and Aldrin landed on the moon in the lunar module Eagle. As Neil Armstrong stepped onto the moon, he said these famous words, "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." This historic moon landing made headlines all around the world. Neil Armstrong was born on his grandparents' farm in Ohio on August 5, 1930. Neil became interested in airplanes as a child. When he was 2 years old, his father took him to the National Air Races in Cleveland, Ohio. Then, at 6 years old, Neil flew in an airplane for the first time. After that, Neil read every book he could find on airplanes and flying. Neil was a very curious child. He liked to ask lots of questions and learn new things all the time. Armstrong wanted to learn to fly. He started taking flying lessons when he was 15 years old. These lessons were expensive, and Neil had to pay for them himself. He worked at different jobs around the airport to make the money he needed. On his 16th birthday, Neil got his pilot's license. He got it before his automobile driver's license and before he graduated high school. Not only did Neil fly airplanes, he built his own model planes from scratch, not from kits like most people. He wanted to know how each part of a plane worked. He even made a small wind tunnel in the basement of his parents' home. He forced air through it at controlled speeds so he could study the effects of airflow. Neil eventually became interested in space, too. He was fascinated when he looked through a very large telescope and saw the stars, the moon, and the planets. In 1947, Neil entered Purdue University in Indiana. It was one of the best engineering schools in the United States. He was able to go there on a U.S. Navy scholarship, and the Navy paid for Neil's college education. He studied math, science, and aviation. 2 years later, he was called to active duty by the Navy. Navy flight training lasted for 18 months. When he turned 20 years old, he got his jet fighter pilot wings and was the youngest jet pilot in his squadron. Being a fighter pilot was dangerous, but Neil was excited because now he could fly jets. In 1950, the Korean War broke out. This was a war between North and South Korea, which lasted from 1950 to 1953. China fought on North Korea's side. The United States fought to help South Korea. Neil Armstrong was sent to fight in this war as a U.S. Navy jet fighter pilot. Neil flew 78 combat missions in Korea. His plane was shot down once. He ejected from it and survived. Neil was given 3 medals to honor his bravery and military service. When the Korean War ended, Armstrong returned to college and graduated in 1955. After college, Neil became a skilled test pilot. Neil was one of the first 3 pilots to fly the X-15 plane. He made 7 flights in it. The X-15 set many speed and altitude records in the early 1960s. It reached the edge of space and was a model for future spacecraft. In 1962, Neil Armstrong became an astronaut. 4 years later, Neil made his first trip into space aboard the Gemini 8 spacecraft. He stayed in orbit around the Earth for less than 10 hours. When Neil's spacecraft spun out of control, Neil calmly solved the problem by bringing the Gemini 8 safely back to Earth. In January 1969, Neil was chosen to lead the Apollo 11 moon mission along with Buzz Aldrin and Michael Collins. During the months that followed, the 3 men prepared by studying moon maps, weather, and rocks. They had to learn how to work in their spacesuits and control the spacecraft. The purpose of this Apollo mission was to perform the first human landing on the moon and return safely to Earth. On July 16th, 1969, the three astronauts took off in a Saturn V rocket from the Kennedy Space Center in Florida. It took this rocket 4 days to reach the moon. The rocket didn't actually land on the moon, though. On July 19th, Apollo 11 reached the moon and orbited 30 times. The next day, Armstrong and Aldrin went on board the lunar module named Eagle. Eagle landed on the moon's surface on July 20th, 1969. "The Eagle has landed," Neil said to Mission Control. Then Neil Armstrong climbed down the steps of the Eagle and became the first person to walk on the moon. People everywhere stared silently at their televisions and watched as he took these extraordinary first steps. Aldrin followed Armstrong, and the two began a series of scientific experiments. They also placed a U.S. flag on the moon's surface. The astronauts reported that walking on the moon, which has a 1/6 the gravity of Earth, was not difficult. After almost 22 hours on the moon, Aldrin and Armstrong returned to the Eagle and left the moon's surface to rejoin Collins in Columbia. They then began the trip back to Earth. Apollo 11 landed safely in the Pacific Ocean on July 24, 1969. A total of 12 men would walk on the surface of the moon before the Apollo program ended in 1972. Several other countries had also tried to send men to the moon, but the United States was the first to succeed in this mission. When the Apollo 8 returned to Earth, Neil Armstrong became an American hero. Comprehension questions. In what state was Neil Armstrong born? How old was Neil when he got his pilot's license? Why did Armstrong build a wind tunnel in the basement of his parents' home? Neil Armstrong flew jets in which war? What was special about the X-15 plane? What was the name of the first spacecraft that took Armstrong to space? Apollo 11 landed on the moon on what date? Who were the three astronauts who piloted the Apollo 11 spacecraft? Who also went with Armstrong and walked on the moon? What is the famous quote Neil Armstrong said as he stepped onto the moon? What was the name of the lunar module? What object did the astronauts put on the moon? The gravity of the moon is what fraction of the Earth's gravity? How many American men have walked on the moon? What happened to the Apollo program?